Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Hello. I apologize for the delay. We were having some technical troubles with dear ye old Tube of the U. And I really appreciate those of you who were super patient in getting this live video started. So hello, welcome. If you are new here, my name is Dustin. Welcome to my channel. This is Modern Metaphysical, where we talk about all things esoteric, occult, and tarot related. And this is the next video in our tarot deep dive series, where we're looking at every individual major arcana card in the Rider Tarot, and today we're deep diving into the Hierophant. So I'm super excited to share with you guys all of the fun things that we can talk about when it comes to the Hierophant card. As with all of my live chats, if you have questions or comments that you want me to see, be sure to put them in all caps or do @ModernMetaphysical in chat so I don't miss them. And if you're watching this in future times, feel free to throw your questions and comments down in the comment section below. I would love to hear what your thoughts or your questions or any of those things are as you're watching the video. As always, down in the description box, you will find all of the links to my social media, to where you can reach out and connect with me, as well as a link to my personal website where you can book your own reading with me or purchase some of my own handmade metaphysical goods. So thank you so much for coming to hang out, and let's dive into the Hierophant, which I'm super excited about. So I'll throw the link in chat to our blog post, which goes over all of the things that we're going to be talking about today when it comes to the Hierophant card. In the blog post, you'll also find all of the usual references and links to things that I reference in this presentation, as well as books that I referenced and things like that. All of that's down at the bottom of the blog post. And then when the video is done publishing, we will throw the YouTube video in there as well. So keep that in mind. Now, who's excited for the Hierophant? There's so many of you guys here. Again, thank you all for coming and hanging out. I see Shadowcat, Drop of Golden Tarot, who is making some delicious cookies, or probably has made them by now. And Lisa, and Bunny Kisses. Oh my gosh, there's so many of you guys here. So hello. Hello. Oh my god. So I hope you guys are excited. So let's dive in to the Hierophant card. So before we get into the Hierophant card, I want to paint a little bit of a historical picture for all of you. The Hierophant, it's interesting to me because whenever I talk to people who are not into the occult or who are not into tarot per se, about the tarot, or the fact that I'm a tarot reader and a tarot content creator and things like that, you know, I get the usual like, oh, you're a fortune teller, or oh, you like to play with the devil's playing cards, and things like that. And one of the things that I often talk to people about is that, you know, it's interesting because a lot of people think that tarot is a pagan thing, and it's really not, right? Now, when we're talking about this, the history of tarot, we can of course trace tarot way through time, all the way to the east, right, into Asia, where we had playing card games that made their way into the Middle East and transformed into proto-tarot decks such as the famous Mamluk deck. But really the core of what we know as tarot today is rooted in Renaissance Italy, okay? And a lot of that is what we colloquially call the Marseille tradition of tarot today. When we talk about tarot systems, right? A lot of people reference a Rider system, a Marseille system, and a Thoth system, which is interesting because both Thoth and the Rider tarot are based off of the Golden Dawn system. Now, that being said, right, when we talk about Marseille, right, that was a term that was coined by a playing card historian whose last name was Merlin, by the way. Can we talk about how cool that was? Because I want the last name Merlin. But he kind of coined that term to as an umbrella term, talking about decks that were produced in the Marseille region of France. And Levi, the famous occultist, kind of picked up on that, and he can kind of be, I guess, attributed to its sort of broader use that has evolved today into just really describing any kind of old European style tarot, right? When we're talking about Marseille, right, everybody thinks about cards that look like this, right? This is generally what people think of, right? And that's true, right, for the most part. So it definitely doesn't encompass everything there is, right? And it is definitely one of those umbrella terms. But the history that I kind of want to paint for you guys is the history when these kinds of decks were being produced specifically in Italy and throughout Europe. So we're talking around the time of the Renaissance. Okay, so let's get into our Renaissance clothing. Let's go to the Renaissance festival, get our turkey legs, and chew down on those, right? And the reason why is because when these decks were being produced, right, they're full of Catholic symbolism and ideology and depictions, right? We have the high priestess is typically the female version of the Pope, right? The Pepes. We have the Pope, the Pope. We also have cards such as Death being depicted as the Grim Reaper. We have cards like the Last Judgment, which is a biblical scene of the end of days, which held an incredibly significant importance to the period and the people of this time, right? So Catholicism was massive, of course, during this time, and you know the power of the church and things like that, right? It wasn't until later in the Renaissance that we had the very first sort of break in that, which was good old Henry VIII deciding that, you know, if you're not going to give me a divorce, I'm going to divorce the church. But prior to that, right, the Catholic Church is one of the most powerful organizations in Europe. And the Pope was at the head of that, okay? And not only did the Pope represent the figural head of this spiritual religious organization, but he also was the head of a city-state, okay? He was a king just as much as the king of France or any other city-state in Italy, and he controlled what were known as the Papal States. And if we scroll down here in our blog post, I've included a really beautiful map. Now, this is a later map. It's not quite the time period that we're talking about these decks in, but it gives you a good sort of indication of the lands that the Pope physically controlled, right, that he ruled over. And it's the area in green in the sort of central area of Rome, where Rome is, right? So Rome's kind of over in here, and he kind of controlled all of these lands. Now, of course, these borders changed and fluctuated through time, you know, just like anything in history. So do keep that in mind. But I thought this was a really pretty map, and I kind of wanted to give you guys a general idea of the lands and things that he had control over. The Pope had an army. You know, the Pope was a king for all intents and purposes, okay? And when these decks were being created, right, when we talk about the history of tarot, these decks were being created by noble families, right, for kings and nobles to use and play playing card games with, to gamble and things like that, right? It wasn't until later that we started developing, it started developing spiritual significance for people. And of course that there's lots of different things like that to get into, but we're not going to dive into that today. But I kind of wanted to paint a picture for you of the time period and of the significance of this figure, the Pope, right? And of the power of the church during this time. And because of that, when we take all of that into context, which I think is critical when you're studying the tarot, is to understand that context, right? then it becomes clear why we have so much Christian iconography and symbolism within the tarot, even the tarot decks that we have today, right? Because when we're talking about a lot of the decks that people use today, they often fall into three categories, right? Marseille, Thoth, or RWS. Those are the three kind of big things that people talk about more often. RWS and Thoth can be grouped together under the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn took a lot of its sort of ideas from the Marseille traditional decks, and the Marseille traditional decks are just chock full of Christian iconography and symbolism. So that's kind of how we got to where we are, and having the Pope depicted in the tarot deck, right? And when we look at Waite's depiction of this card, right, it is very much the Pope, like the Pope in Rome. Now, that's not to say that other decks haven't departed from that, right? In fact, even in older antique decks that follow the Marseille tradition, we have some who depict this Trump as Jupiter, right? And now there's a lot of academic debate about why Key 5 was depicted as Jupiter, and of course the High Priestess is depicted as Juno in some of these decks. Some people think it's to kind of remove the church from the tarot for occult reasons. Some people feel like it was during a lot of sort of periods of Reformation, so depicting the church in sort of an iconographic way was kind of no, so we didn't do that, so we kind of did this like neoclassical thing. There's not a like cut and dry answer to why. There's not a primary source of one of these deck creators saying, today I made a tarot deck, and instead of doing the Pope, I did Jupiter, and here's why, right? We don't really have that. So all we can do is make inferences based on, geopolitical things, cultural indicators, and things like that. But it is worth noting, right, that one of the major departures from the Hierophant or the Pope is Jupiter in a select few decks. But in terms of this card, right, historically, its title and its imagery have remained pretty consistent through time, right? There are very few decks that have wild departures on this card until we start getting into the more modern neo-pagan influenced decks, right? So, keep that in mind as we're talking about this. Now, the title of the card, right, when we talk about the Hierophant, right, some people are like, why does he keep saying the Pope, right? Well, the Hierophant is the Pope card, right? When we're talking about classical tarot decks, right, the title of the card is the Pope, right, in various different languages, right? This is one of my favorite popes. This is just I don't even know how to explain how much I love this Pope, because look at his little face. He's kind of derpy, and I love it. But this is from the Piatnik Tarot de Marseille. But we have a lot of the traditional symbols that we see continued forward through time, right? Now, when we're talking about the visual evolution of this card, right, how it evolved visually, when we look at some of our earliest decks, such as the Visconti Sforza, let's scroll over here, we have the Pope enthroned, wearing the papal tiara. Yes, it's a tiara and not a crown, which is one of my favorite distinctions of all time. Wearing the papal tiara, he's enthroned. He has a traditional sort of pastoral staff and things like that. When we get to the Marseille traditional decks, we see, again, he's enthroned. We get the pillars behind him. We get the supplicants at his feet. We get him holding the triple cross, right? Very, very similar to what we see in Riders, in Arthur Edward Waite's Rider deck. Pappas, of course, takes the more occult Egyptian sort of vibe to it. Now, it's interesting. There's a symbol here that I want you to pay special attention to, and that is the crown being depicted on the Pope, which is the same crown we see in the High Priestess card, which is really interesting correlation, because later, Waite chooses to very distinctly draw a line between the High Priestess and the Pope, or the Hierophant card, which a lot of occultists have always sort of drawn a connection to, right? The High Priestess being traditionally la papesse, right? The female Pope, and the Pope, or the High Priestess and the High Priest, right? We can then trace that tradition all the way back to pagan temples, right? But it's interesting that Pappas has made a kind of a connection there. But when we move forward in time and we get into the Golden Dawn era, right, and we're looking at Crowley and Waite's comparatively, we see again a very traditional figure of the Pope seated. Now, of course, Crowley's is full of esoteric meaning, and he brings in a lot of those occult tones that Pappas had, especially with the Egyptian sort of philosophies and things like that, and we'll get into that when we talk about the meaning of the card and things like that. But in terms of how the card is depicted, right, over time, it really hasn't changed that much. A lot like the Emperor, right? The Emperor stayed pretty much the same. And that is noteworthy, right? Because the significance of this figure, or this trope, of the ideas that it represents, of the historical figure, and it also represents a figure that still exists today, right? The Pope today still exists. He's still the ruler of a sovereign nation. Okay, Vatican City is a sovereign nation. For if you're not familiar with this, Vatican City is not a part of Italy or Rome or anything like that. It is a sovereign nation, and its head of state is the Pope, and it is still one of the most powerful countries in the world, even though it's one of the smallest, interestingly enough. But when we're talking about this card, right, and the way it's depicted, it really hasn't changed that much. So it's really telling to the significance of this figure on not only tarot, but on Western culture as a whole, right? Even as we see it carried forward to today, even in modern decks, right? This is a card from the Tarot of Heaven and Earth, which of course is based heavily on occult traditions and things like that, but we still see a Pope, a card that depicts the Pope, right? So, before we dive any further, let me know if there's any questions in chat. I just want to check on that. Don't see any. Cute Pope. I know, isn't he cute? The Piatnik Tarot has some of the best faces. I love and adore the faces in this deck, because they're all cute. They're super fun. I can't believe we're almost 30 minutes in already, you guys. It's nuts. No questions. All right. Let's keep going. And as always, if you have questions that come up later, feel free to drop them in the comment section below. I'm more than happy to answer them. And we will keep on diving into the Pope. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the visual evolution. I did touch on the various different depictions and titles. Of course, the Hierophant, the title the Hierophant often is attributed to Antoine Court de Gablon. And this came from his idea that the Hierophant sort of was the title for the highest level of priesthood in sort of Greco-Roman traditions, specifically the Eleusinian mysteries, right? So that's where we get the term Hierophant from. That's kind of the accepted academic path to the Pope being turned into the Hierophant, even though the card still is very much depicted in a Catholic way, right? And then in terms of depictions, there's very little in terms of deviation, right? Jupiter being the exception, and then of course the Golden Dawn when it comes to title, because they always love having these really dramatic titles, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But let's talk a little bit about the evolution of the card's meaning, right? How the card changed in its meaning. And much like the depiction of the card, it really didn't change that much, right? So Millet, again, calls it Jupiter, right? We talked about that briefly, 1781. When we get to Levi, right, he associates it with the Hebrew letter He. The Pope, he calls it the Pope, and associates it with indication, demonstration, instruction, law, symbolism, philosophy, and religion, which we see a lot of those sort of associations move forward all the way through time. Mathers, who Waite, of course, regarded very highly, talks about mercy and kindness and goodness, right? And he calls it the Hierophant or the Pope. The Golden Dawn gives it the amazing name Magus of the Eternal Gods, right? Or the Hierophant, and associates it with aspiration, power of the keys, which is a very Christian idea, which we'll talk about when we get to the symbols in the Rider Tarot, the keys of St. Peter, right? The outward show of spiritual authority. And I want to highlight that word because I think it's important. Again, the outward show of spiritual authority, right? Authority is kind of the key word there. The temporal power of official religion, right? Temporal meaning here on earth. On the evil side, or the reverse of the card, right? Sacerdotal tyranny, interference, right? When we get to Waite, he calls it the Hierophant, associates it with marriage, right? And it's interesting to me because when I see a lot of people interpret cards, they associate marriage with the Lover's card, when Waite specifically says marriage is associated with the Hierophant card, which is interesting, right? But marriage, alliance, and then servitude, which is an interesting thing to combine there, right? By another account, Mathers, so he then directly quotes Mathers and says, mercy and goodness, inspiration, the man whom the inquirer has recourse. And then Crowley, of course, is not without... he's not for lack of words, describes the card as, it is impossible at present time to explain this card thoroughly, for only the course of events can show how the new current of initiation will work out. It is the aeon of Horus, of the child. Through the face of the Hierophant appears benign and smiling, and the child himself seems glad with wanton innocence. It is hard to deny that in the expression of the initiator is something mysterious, even sinister. He seems to be enjoying a very secret joke at somebody's expense. There is a distinctly sadistic aspect to this card, not unnaturally, since it derives from the legend of Pasiphae, the prototype of all legends of bull gods. These still persist in such religions as Shaivism and Christianity itself. The symbolism of the wand is peculiar. The three interlaced rings which crown it may be taken as representative of the three aeons of Isis, Osiris, and Horus, with their interlocking magical formulae. The upper ring is marked with scarlet for Horus, the two lower rings with green for Isis and pale yellow for Osiris, respectively, right? So here we get this very verbose description of his card, right, which still has a very papal figure at its center, but then we get all sorts of esoteric things layered on top of it, right? And of course, Crowley was not a huge fan of Catholicism or the church in general. So we kind of get that salty taste in his mouth when it comes to this description of the card. And again, we get an echoing back to Pappus's deck with this sort of ideas of the legends of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Okay, so in terms of the meaning of the card, right, there's very little change throughout time. Crowley's probably is the most dramatic change from historical decks, and if we kind of take Crowley out of the formulae, right, a lot of what we see in the earlier descriptions of the card, Mathers, Golden Dawn, Waite, etc., hold very true even to modern descriptions of the card today, right? If you were to pick up, the True Heart Intuitive Tarot or something like that, right? Even if the card isn't specifically depicting a pope, right? Even if we grab something like Oak, Ash, and Thorn, which is a nature animal-based deck, right? The meaning of that card is still heavily associated with the concepts that are outlined here historically, right? So there's significance there. Drop of Golden Tarot says it makes sense that the institution of marriage because people are joined by the authority of God. Yes. Yeah, there's a lot. There's a ton of Christian and Catholic ideas and associations within the tarot. So, and it's interesting because a lot of people come to the tarot from a neo-pagan path, right? They find the tarot through paganism, whether it's Wicca or heathenism or whatever it is. It's usually through an occult, metaphysical, or new age path that people come to the tarot. And I always have an internal chuckle when people talk about how much they hate like Christian stuff and then talk about how much they love the tarot. And I'm like, but historically the tarot is rooted in these ideas, just from a purely academic standpoint, right? Spiritually, that's a whole different discussion. There's no right or wrong answer there. But from a historical academic perspective, right, it's undeniable the influence of Christianity on the tarot as we see it today, even on the Rider deck. So it's important, I think, if you're going to study the tarot, to understand the context of that, to understand the symbolism behind those symbols and those concepts and those philosophies and ideologies that are presented within the cards that come from that spiritual path. I think it's critically important. So, but when we look at the card, right, itself, and how it's evolved over time, it's one of the most consistent cards in the major arcana, right? The Emperor is very similar, right? And of course, when we talk about the Emperor, the High Priestess, and the Pope, they're probably three of the most consistent in terms of depiction and symbolism and in meaning, even today, right? So what does that tell you about the significance of those cards, not only as sort of idealistic figures in Western society and culture, but in the practice and interpretation of tarot and how we go about it. So it's important to remember those things. Now we get to the fun part. Let's break down all of the symbols that are present within the Rider Tarot. So this is, of course, the deck produced by Arthur Edward Waite, and Pamela Coleman Smith. Short little note here for those of you who I harp on it all the time, right? Primary source material is fantastic. Whenever you get the chance to study anything, you should always reference some primary source material. The Rider Tarot primary source material is available to us, and it just was republished. So if you're looking for a good copy of The Pictorial Key to the Tarot by A.E. Waite, it was recently republished in this little hardback copy, which it's nice. It's not crazy. I'm not mind blown by it. But you can pick it up. It's published by Penguin Publishing Company, and it's a lovely reprint of The Pictorial Key. So if you haven't read this and you read tarot, you really should. I mean, you don't have to, but you should, in my opinion. So yeah, let's break it down. Let's break down this bad boy, right? There's a lot going on here, right? We have the crown. We have the symbol of benediction in his hand. We have the staff. We have the supplicants at his feet. We have the keys at his feet. And we have the pillars, right? Those are kind of the big things that we see in this card, okay? So the first thing people usually latch onto is the papal tiara. And again, it is a tiara, not a crown. And the papal tiara, right, is also known as the triregnum, the crown of triregnum, or the tiara of triregnum. Tri meaning three, regnum meaning reigning or rulership, right? And so it represents his three rulerships as supreme pastor, as supreme teacher, and as supreme priest, right? People also usually link it with the threefold authority of right, his ecclesiastical jurisdiction, temporal power, and as the universal pastor, also as the father of princes and of kings, and the ruler of the world, and the vicar of Christ, right? So there are a lot of these three concept ideas that are associated with his crown. The next sort of piece of his regalia, of course, is the papal cross. And a lot of people often confuse this with the cross of Lorraine, which is often also confused with the archiepiscopal cross, which is carried by archbishops. And it's important to remember that those are all different things. And they're not one and the same. But the papal cross represents the pontiff's highest position within the church, right? And the three crosses are often associated with a triple tau, which is thought to have symbolism close to that of the papal tiara, right? So the three bars of the papal cross generally are considered to be representative of the Trinity, so the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They're also believed to symbolize the realms that come over under the Pope's authority, right? The church, heaven, and the world, right? So there's some overlap there. For those of you who are curious when I'm talking about these other symbols,